What's up, Wizards? It's that time again when walls fall and the very mountains crack. Jack, that's right, it's rotation, and we've got all the same questions we always have this time of year. Which cards do the best decks keep? Which ones do they lose? And how are they going to evolve in order to adjust for those losses? Which decks are on the chopping block? Which decks get to keep on chopping? And what decks get to come from out of nowhere to finally do some chopping of their own when the only sets we have in the format are Throne of Eldraine, Theros Beyond Death, Ikoria, Core Set 2021, and of course, Zendikar. Well, today we're going to try to break it all down brick by brick, card by card, and deck by deck so you know exactly what to expect when autumn comes. Let's get to it. And we're back, and just in case you wanted an itinerary, the basic outline for this video is as follows. First thing we're going to do is go deck by deck and talk about all the most popular and important decks in the meta right now, what they keep, what they lose, and again, like I said at the beginning of the video, how they may evolve to adjust to those changes. Then we're going to talk about some X-Factor decks in this environment that aren't very popular or important in the meta right now, but I definitely think you need to keep an eye out for once autumn hits. After that, last thing we're going to do is talk about the 10 cards that I think you most need to look out for once rotation hits. Now, all of this, of course, comes with the caveat that we have no idea what's in Zendikar Rising, so of course we can't completely plan for the next format, but we can take stock of what cards are most powerful in this format right now, because we know that we're going to be facing them for the next year no matter what's in Zendikar Rising. Now, I think it's only appropriate to start the deck analysis with Temur Reclamation first, because not only is it the biggest, baddest deck in the format at the moment, but it's also arguably the only deck that is 100% DOA upon rotation, because it loses Wilderness Reclamation and Expansion Explosion, so the combo kill is basically lost at that point. But the deck loses other important cards like Growth Spiral, a card that multiple decks lose and will miss very, very much, but it also loses Night Pack Ambusher, which will adversely affect decks like Simic Flash as well, and it loses Ether Gust, which has been in the main deck for quite some time, even in best of 3 at this point. Now, if the deck does get to keep anything, it's probably Euro, and I guess Shark Typhoon, which will stay in the format for another year. But Euro is easily the best card the deck gets to hold on to. The only problem is that I'm not sure that Euro is going to fit best into a Temur shell upon rotation. I don't really see Temur being the best place to park your Euro once the fall hits, so I'm not sure that a Temur control deck is still going to be quite as viable as some other forms of control decks that can take advantage of Euro. That said, if the deck is going to evolve somehow, I think that there is a Temur deck in the format right now that could easily exist and take the place of Reclamation, and that's Adventures, which I have a lot more to say about later. Now, the next deck in the guillotine is Bant, but I'm fairly certain it's going to get to keep its head despite losing a lot of really important stuff, not the least of which is 3-mana Teferi, along with 3-mana Narset and Nissa Who Shakes the World. The deck is going to be dropping Planeswalkers like flies, not to mention it's going to lose Hydroid Krasis and also Growth Spiral, same as Temur Reclamation. But same as Temur Reclamation, it also gets to keep Euro, and I think it's the much better shell for Euro than Temur, at least from what we know about what things are going to look like post-rotation. So what we might see here is a deck that still plays 3 colors, green, blue, and white, so that it can play Euro, but Euro might be the only green card in the deck. It gets to hold on to amazing white cards like Elspeth Conquers Death and Shatter the Sky, which are going to be very important in the upcoming environment almost no matter what happens. It gets to hold on to Ugin, but I'm not sure the deck actually pays Ugin without Nissa in the deck to pay off the ramp plan. It also doesn't have Growth Spiral to ramp, so I think the deck may cut Ugin, but it does have Jol Real still at the bottom end of the curve, so the deck does get to keep a lot of really important pieces, and it can evolve in a number of ways. We might see Bant return to more of a Yorion style of deck, whether it plays Yorion in the companion slot or as a 4 of in the main deck, which we have seen some of in this environment. We may see more Archons of Sun's Grace in the decks if the deck plays more enchantments to take advantage of Yorion, but what I think is probably most likely here is that we go to a sort of Azorius control deck that plays green just for Euro and not much else. That way, you can also have Dream Trawler as a win condition, but more importantly for my point here, you can play things like Neutralize in the main deck. A lot of these Bant decks don't play too many counter spells in the main deck, if any at all, because they're playing things like Narset and Teferi on turn 3, and once rotation evolution hits, they won't have to worry about that. You don't have these 3-mana planeswalkers, and you're not effectively playing tap-out control anymore. We might see a return to more, draw-go styles of control decks here, and that's where neutralize and other counterspell type cards come in. So I think there's a possibility that we see a sort of Azorius control deck that splashes green for Euro and plays a lot of counterspells and Dream Trawler at the top end of the curve. Deck number 3 is Sacrifice in all of its many forms. Will we have to sacrifice the Sacrifice deck once rotation comes? I'm not too sure, actually, although the deck does lose its 2 most important pieces by a mile. Both Priest of Forgotten Gods and Mayhem Devil will rotate out, and that's going to be a major problem for the deck. We also lose incidental stuff like Judith, Gutter Bones, Midnight Reaper, but those aren't anywhere near as important as Priest and Mayhem Devil. But the deck does keep a lot more pieces than you might think it gets to keep. It gets to keep both Cauldron Familiar and Witch's Oven, so it's still got the Cat Oven combo. Keeps Trail of Crumbs. That's pretty interesting. Great card advantage piece. And pretty much anything having to do with food it also keeps, like Corvald, for instance. Another amazing card for the Jund versions of the deck. It keeps Claim the Firstborn, always going to be good with Witch's Oven. Keeps Village Rites, which is a brand new card. To Call of the Death Dweller as well. Keeps Woe Strider, Serrated Scorpion. There's a lot of cards the deck actually does get to hold on to. But again, it loses the 2 most important cards in its arsenal. So it's going to be hard to imagine this one surviving. But it does have some evolution that it can go through. The deck can go back to playing Lurrus again, just like Yorion, whether it's in the companion slot or you play some number of it in the main deck. Those are both viable. It could also go back to playing more copies of Kroxa to go with the Lurrus if it does that. It might experiment with Archfiend's Vessel again, along with things like Village Rites, or Call of the Death Dweller. So there's a lot the deck could do, or we might just see return to Golgari food with Cat Oven and Trail of Crumbs. But likely I think that this deck stops being, having a red-black incarnation because it doesn't have Priest or Mayhem Devil, but it probably keeps the red-black in the deck, just goes Jund so it can still play Corvald. But all of that remains to be seen. The deck will have to survive losing its 2 best cards to actually survive rotation, and that's kind of a tough call to make. But moving on, let's check out Mono Red, everyone's favorite deck, right? Now this deck actually doesn't lose too many cards. It loses 10th Street Dodger, as well as Runaway Steamkin, 2 pretty good cards, especially Steamkin. But most importantly, I think, it also loses Light Up the Stage, which is one of its best gas-up cards that makes sure that it doesn't run out of cards. It's actually very good alongside Runaway Steamkin. Runaway Steamkin can give you a lot of mana, and Light Up the Stage can give you cards to cast with that mana. So it's kind of a 1-2 punch the deck will sorely miss, but when it comes to knockout punches, haymakers, the deck gets to keep pretty much all of them. The deck keeps Torbrand, Embercleave, and Anax, and just these 3 cards I think form the basis of a deck that's always going to be at least somewhat good no matter what 1 and 2 drops it has access to. But in terms of 1s and 2 drops, it still has Fervent Champion, it still has Robber of the Rich. So, we can go back to playing Phoenix of Ash maybe in the 3-drop slot. The deck hasn't really played that card in a while. So there's definitely things we can put in the deck in order to fill some of these slots that we're losing. The deck could play more Rimrock Knights than it has been playing, or it could just go, for instance, Red-White and play Boros Knights, for instance. We've got things like Worthy Knight in this format, Venerable Knight, and Knights aren't going to rotate out anytime soon. On a similar note, we could just play Paw Blade, the Boros Dogs deck, because boy, does that deck love an Embercleave. So I guess if Mono Red wanted to shift into another color, I could see it adding white for one reason or another, but I'm fairly certain that we're still going to have access to a pretty sweet Mono Red list, just because we have the core of Torbrand, Embercleave, and Anax. But let's move on to Sultai Ramp here. Now, this one I think is actually a very interesting case. Originally, I wasn't going to include it in the video, but the more I thought about it, the more I like Sultai in the upcoming format. We do lose Growth Spiral, just like all the other ramp decks, and that is going to be a huge hit to any ramp deck. But that said, there are some things it keeps. I want to go over the rest of the things it loses, because just like the other decks, it loses Nissa, Hydroid Krasis, but this one also loses Casualties of War, along with Vraska, and I guess Arboreal Grazer, a card the deck usually plays 3 to 4 copies of. But just like the other green-blue decks, this deck gets to keep Euro, it gets to keep Cultivate, and I think most importantly for this deck, it gets to keep Ugin. Now, I definitely think, like I said earlier, that Azorius Control with counterspells could be a real deck in the upcoming format, but Sultai looks pretty good in that direction as well. Right now, the Sultai deck plays very, very few permanents so that it doesn't have to lose anything to a Ugin that you actually end up playing and then minusing. You know, sometimes that deck can play a Nissa and then -4 an Ugin to keep its Nissa, and that's more or less the game. But obviously we're going to be losing Nissa in the upcoming formats, so the deck has even fewer permanents that it absolutely must play. So I think Sultai is in an interesting position where it can play almost no permanents whatsoever fairly easily along, except for maybe Euro. The Bant deck doesn't necessarily have the ability to do that because it wants to play Elspeth Conquers Death and a couple of other key permanents, maybe even Jolreal, so you don't see as many Shatters in that deck. But, the Sultai deck still has access to Extinction Event and a couple of other sweepers that might be important. And the big takeaway here is that it really just doesn't have to play any permanents if it doesn't really want to. So I think this deck is much more conducive to ramping into an Ugin, and it's more conducive to actually being able to hold up mana for counterspells. Because again, there just really aren't that many permanents you want to play. But if the deck did want to play more permanents, more creatures, it could play things like Atris if it wanted to. The deck sometimes plays 2 copies of this card, but it's kind of been out of fashion lately, as the deck does play fewer and fewer creatures. But you could play Scavenging Ooze in some number if you wanted a threat. You could play Gadwick to replace your Hydroid Krasis. That's true of any deck with blue in it. If you still ramp, for whatever reason, you could just play Gadwick, and it's not quite a Hydroid Krasis, but it's as close as we may get in the upcoming format. So I do want to keep an eye on Gadwick, but I do think there's a case to be made for Sultai being a good pure control deck in the upcoming format, more so than some of the other decks. But next deck I want to look at is Mono Green Stompy, a deck that is actually in a delicious position in the upcoming format. Now, I don't want to make it sound that the deck doesn't lose anything, because it does. It loses a number of cards. It loses Pelt Collector, which is actually very important. It loses Growth Chamber Guardian, loses 4 mana Vivian, the decks that do play it, Shifting Ceratops out of the sideboard, which is very important against control decks. It loses Barkhide Troll as a great 2-drop, Crawl Harpooner as another great 2-drop. So the deck does lose a fair number of things, but it doesn't lose anything very important, aside from maybe, again, Pelt Collector and Ceratops out of the board. The deck gets to keep Questing Beast, the best card in the deck, gets to keep Yorvo, Primal Might, Lovestruck Beast, gets to keep the Great Hinge, Scavenging Ooze, Stone Coil, Steve Austin, Gem Razor. I mean, you just go on and on with cards this deck gets to keep. It's more than it loses in a lot of ways, and I think that it's fairly easy to replace some of these cards. We are going to have to replace Pelt Collector in the 1-drop slot and at least one of these 2-drops, whether it's Growth Chamber Guardian or Barkhide Troll, but the deck already has access to Wildwood Tracker in the 1-drop slot, which is effectively a 1-mana 2/2 on your attack step, which is very good stats. And in the 2-drop slot, we could see Sir Farron picking up some slack, but hopefully we get a great 2-drop in the Zendikar set. We could also, by the way, play Wildborn Preserver in the 2-drop slot. So again, the deck still has access to plenty of cards it could play to pick up the slack for some of the cards that it's losing. So I think Mono Green Stompy is looking really, really healthy once the format shifts. But last deck I want to look at here is Mono Black Aggro, because this deck loses some pieces, gets to keep some others. Very kind of a balanced win-loss here. Now, as far as the cards it loses some important stuff. Rotting Regisaur, Spawn of Mayhem, Knight of the Ebon Legion, and Gutter Bones. So its 2 most important 1-drops and its 2 most important 3-drops, because very often Spawn of Mayhem is going to be a 3-drop. This is the deck that made Spawn of Mayhem good. It's also the deck that leverages Rotting Regisaur the best, mostly because of how good Demonic Embrace is. But it does get to keep Demonic Embrace, gets to keep Rankle, gets to keep Black Lance Paragon, right? But I'm honestly not too sure after losing Rotting Regisaur and Spawn that the deck is going to be very good. It also doesn't have Knight of the Ebon Legion anymore, like I said, to punish slow starts and be something that even if your opponent can blow up some of your other stuff, if you can get down a Knight of the Ebon Legion early, it can be a good threat throughout the entire game. And it's just probably not going to have a 1-drop like that anymore. So I'm just not quite sure that Mono Black is going to be good. It really depends on what we see in the next set. It's got to be something that's good enough for Demonic Embrace to enchant and effectively win the game with, like Rotting Regisaur or Spawn of Mayhem. But if the deck doesn't get the aggro pieces that it needs, I could perhaps see this deck evolving back into just mono black devotion, right? We've still got Ayara, we've still got Grey Merchant of Asphodel, and half of the format is getting cut down at the knees in a month here. So maybe, possibly, we'll find an environment once the smoke settles and the dust clears. We'll find ourselves in an environment where the Grey Merchant of Asphodel deck can actually thrive. I wouldn't necessarily be sure about that because, again, I think control decks are going to be popular. And I think that aggro decks that can just go up underneath the mono black deck may also be very popular. So it's kind of tough to tell, but if the mono black aggro deck can't aggro anymore, but you want a mono black, like I want to mono black, I really like to mono black. It might be your best choice just to try and go back to Gary and make that work, but we'll see. Now, as far as X Factor decks that aren't really popular in the format right now, I think there's at least 5 of these that I want to briefly touch on. Adventures is probably the deck that has the biggest chance of breaking out in the next environment. Again, we have no idea what's in Zendikar Rising, but just from what I can tell of all of the decks that don't see too much play now but are good decks, have proven themselves in the past, I think Adventures is the most likely to be a real factor in the upcoming standard meta. Adventures gets to keep Edgewall Innkeeper, Lucky Clover, Brazen Borrower, Bone Crusher Giant, Fae of Wishes, Beanstalk Giant, just a litany of amazing cards. I mean, obviously, it's a mechanic in Throne of Eldraine, so it really doesn't lose like any cards whatsoever. And again, once we lose half of the format in one fell swoop, Adventures might be there to finally shine the way it should. But another deck that's kind of based around a self-contained mechanic, it's all in one set and no other sets, that I think could swoop in and take the mantle as one of the top tier decks is Cycling. This is already an amazing deck in the best of 1 meta that has a 70+% win rate, and it's already proven too that in some tournaments it's had a 70+% win rate in game 1 of best of 3 matches. So Cycling is an incredible best of 1 deck, but it could be a real best of 3 deck once rotation comes, because again, we're losing half of the format here. So, maybe control decks really do rise up and become real, actual decks. Counterspells get more play in the upcoming format. And if that's the case, then Zenith Flare is not a good card. Not necessarily, but if we're seeing a lot of aggro, then cards like Zenith Flare and Flourishing Fox and Valiant Rescuer are probably going to be amazing, especially in best of 1. I really don't think the deck is going anywhere, but in real big boy best of 3 Magic, can the deck survive? I actually think it's going to be much better once rotation comes about, so keep that in mind. But there's another self-contained mechanic. Note that there's a theme here, and that is Mutate. Mutate, I think with cards like Auspicious Sterix and Migratory Greathorn and a couple of other all-stars, could actually be a real deck. I hesitate to say that because, in a format full of sweepers, and a format without Paradise Druid, that's a big card the deck does lose. I'm not sure that Mutate can really compete the way that it tries to compete nowadays. Again, I think losing Paradise Druid is probably the biggest, hit to this deck. But Auspicious Sterix and Greathorn are just good enough cards by themselves that I think Mutate could at least make a run at the top tiers, but I'm not sure it'll quite make the jump. Other decks that I'm kind of interested in here are Winota. Now, the problem is we lose half the cards in the format, so I'm not sure we're going to have quite as many things that are good with Winota. Winota is probably one of those cards that functions best on a full format, on a full stomach, right? So we're probably not going to have as many cool things that work with Winota, but just keep your eye on her. Winota is always going to be a good card, and especially once the format does start filling back up, we get a couple more sets, there could be some amazing things to go with Winota Rider here. But the other deck that I'm kind of looking at as an X factor here is Doom Foretold, a deck that since Throne of Eldraine came out has been trying to break into the higher levels of standard. It still has its believers and its detractors for that matter, but Doom Foretold is a very powerful card, and it really does not lose much. The deck itself does not lose much. Yeah, you lose Oath of Kaya, you lose 3 mana Teferi, but for the most part you can still run this deck pretty easily in the upcoming format, and Doom Foretold is obviously not rotating out anytime soon. So I just want to keep your eyes, or all of our eyes, on Doom Foretold, because this is a card that's been looking to break out for months, actually almost a year. Doom Foretold has been trying to break out, and it may finally have that chance. But next up, let's quickly go card by card over 10, well really 11 cards that I think you need to look out for in the upcoming format. The honorable mention being Zenith Flare. I've already mentioned the cycling deck, so I'm not going to spend too long on this, but just remember that Zenith Flare exists. It might be one of the most important cards in fall standard. But aside from that, Number 10, I'll say Dream Trawler / Neutralize, again, just in case Control becomes a real deck. I think Dream Trawler is a great win condition, and obviously Neutralize is a great counterspell. But there's more than that. Neutralize is just kind of representative of counterspells. Number 9, Cat Oven. I'm going to make this one card here, because Cat Oven, just remember that that's a deck. It's going to be one of the most powerful interactions in the upcoming standard, very likely. Number 8, Questing Beast. It's amazing this card's going to stay in the format, and will probably make mono green or perhaps some sort of green X aggro deck. Very, very important in the upcoming standard. Number 7 is Ugin. Again, remember this card's in the format. Even though we lose Growth Spiral and Arboreal Grazer, there will still be plenty of ramp to make sure you can get Papa Ugin out, and it's going to be an amazing game ender in a lot of situations. Number 6, Brazen Borrower and Bone Crusher, but I could just say adventure cards here. Maybe even Fae of Wishes belongs on this entry. But Brazen and Bone Crusher are the two most powerful adventure cards. And if Adventures is in a deck, these will still be extremely powerful and very much played in different decks in the environment. So remember they exist. Number 5, Scavenging Ooze. That's mostly because Euro and other escape creatures are still going to be very, very popular in the format, and Elspeth Conquers Death is still going to be in the format as well. So Scavenging Ooze is going to be a very important creature coming up here. Number 4 is Shatter the Sky, just because it's probably going to be the best sweeper we have access to. It's not going anywhere anytime soon, and control decks are going to want to use this. Number 3 is 3 cards, Embercleave, Torbrand, and Anax, because I couldn't pick a mono red card that I like the best, although it's probably Embercleave, just because Embercleave gets much, much better in a standard that doesn't have 3 mana to fairy. All instant speed cards do, but Embercleave is really looking to take a jump. I promise you, once 3 mana to fairy is gone and you can actually play your Embercleave at instant speed, it's going to be a much better card. Keep your eye out for it. Number 2 is Elspeth Conquers Death. Now, this doesn't have 3 mana to fairy or 5 mana Nissa to kill anymore upon rotation, but that doesn't mean it won't have lots and lots of things that you want to kill with it, and lots and lots of things you want to get back with it. Elspeth Conquers Death is one of the most powerful cards in the format right now, and I don't see that changing in a month. Number 1, probably guessed it, Euro. This is definitely, almost no matter how Zendikar Rising looks, this is probably still going to be the single most powerful card in Standard once rotation hits, and I don't see them banning it anytime soon, right? So I think the Euro is just by a huge margin, the most powerful card in the format upon rotation, and you can even make the argument it's the most powerful card in the Standard right now. So I don't think that there's not going to be any more Euro decks just because we lose Growth Spiral. I think Euro is still going to be easily one of the most played cards in the format. Plan accordingly. But the last thing I'll say here before I get out of it, I hope this was fairly concise analysis, but the last thing I'll say is that we have a Shocklands problem, and that is that, of course, the Shocklands are rotating out. Now, we might get them again in Zendikar Rising. That would be the most elegant solution to this quote-unquote problem, but we might get, say, Painlands instead, or some other tap land, which would be kind of awful, but, maybe we'll get Painlands or some other tap land. But if we get Painlands or Shocklands back, Painlands being the ones that you tap for a damage apiece, but if we get Painlands or Shocklands or some other untapped dual land, then things pretty much stay the same in terms of what decks can play 3 colors and what decks can't and all that. But if we don't get an untapped dual-colored land in the upcoming format, things are going to get dicey for 3-colored decks really, really quick, even though they have triomes. So keep that in mind. I don't know how good decks like Bant are going to be, or Sultai, or Jeskai, or any of that, if we don't get the proper untapped dual lands. Also, if we don't get the proper untapped dual lands, 2-color aggro decks are also more or less done, because 2-color aggro decks are already very difficult to pull off with the mana that we have at the moment. So I imagine if we lose the Shocklands, then 2-color aggro decks are going to be more or less out the window. That said, there's going to be a lot of good mono-colored aggro decks, like mono red, mono green, and even mono white, that we could be playing. So aggro may be all mono-colored in the upcoming format. It all depends on what happens with Shocklands. I just wanted to bring that up, because Shocklands and whether or not we get them are going to be one of the major determining factors in what decks we do and don't have access to in the upcoming format. If we have more untapped lands, that's going to mean a lot for 3-color decks and 2-color aggro. But, I could still see an Azorius aggro deck that splashes green so they can play Euro. Definitely a possibility, but it's going to be much harder without breeding pools and whatnot. So just keep that in mind. I definitely think that Shocklands are going to be one of the most important things to get. Or again, some sort of untapped duel is going to be very important to determining, again, what this format is going to look like in total. But aside from that, I'm fairly certain that's all the rotation analysis I got for you right now. I hope you enjoyed this. If there were any decks that I missed in analyzing, or any decks that I missed talking about all the decks that could be X factors, make sure you let me know down there. What are your favorite decks lose? What do they gain? What do they keep? All that stuff down there in the comments section. Aside from that, like I said at the beginning, like, subscribe. I worked really hard on this one, in case you can't tell by all the different picture images that took hours to edit. So make sure you like and subscribe. Join the Patreon if you really want to help me out. It's just $1 a month to vote on content. And yeah, that's a pretty good deal, if I say so myself. You can also go over to TCG Player to check out any of the cards that I listed in this video if you want to pick up any of that stuff before rotation happens. All these most powerful cards post-rotation. Do it through the link in the description. That'll help you dude out as well. But aside from that, I'm more or less done with this one. Just let me know how you felt about all the analysis down there in the comments section, and I will catch you cats later. I'm Dev from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.